British influence in Ireland began many centuries ago. The Norman invasion in 1169 marked the start of this long relationship. English kings gradually sought to extend their control over the island. However, Ireland was not easily conquered. For hundreds of years, Gaelic culture and language remained strong. Many areas continued to follow Irish laws and customs. Early English settlers, known as the Old English, often adopted Irish ways. They sometimes even learned the Irish language. This assimilation worried the English crown, which desired complete authority. The Tudor conquests in the 16th century brought significant changes. These military campaigns were brutal and aimed to subdue Ireland fully. A policy of plantation was introduced. This involved confiscating land from Irish lords. The land was then given to Protestant settlers from England and Scotland. These new settlers brought the English language and English customs. The plantations deliberately disrupted Gaelic society. The traditional Irish way of life faced immense pressure. The power of the Gaelic chieftains began to weaken considerably during this period. A pivotal moment was the 9 Years' War at the end of the 16th century. Irish lords fought against English rule. The defeat of the Irish forces led to the flight of the Earls in 1607. Prominent Gaelic noblemen left Ireland for continental Europe. This event symbolized the collapse of the old Gaelic aristocracy. Their departure created a power vacuum. This vacuum was quickly filled by English administrators and settlers. English influence spread more rapidly across the country. The foundations for deeper Anglicization were firmly laid. As English power grew, the Irish language faced increasing challenges. It became associated with rebellion and resistance to the crown. English, in contrast, was the language of the new ruling class. It was the language of administration, law, and opportunity. The English authorities saw the Irish language as a barrier. It hindered their efforts to control and assimilate the Irish population. Policies to promote English and discourage Irish became more deliberate. This was part of a broader strategy to consolidate British rule and transform Irish society. Initial language policies. The early efforts to promote English were not always systematic. For a long time, English control was mainly focused on an area around Dublin called the Pale. Beyond the Pale, Gaelic culture and language thrived. Irish lords often learned English for practical reasons. They needed it for diplomacy and trade with the English. Some intermarriage also occurred between Norman settlers and Irish families. This led to a degree of cultural and linguistic mixing. However, the underlying aim of the English crown was always Anglicization. This aim became more pronounced over time. One of the earliest significant legal attempts to curb Irish influence was the Statutes of Kilkenny in 1366. These laws were aimed at the English settlers in Ireland. The Crown feared these settlers were becoming more Irish than the Irish themselves. The statutes forbade the English colonists from speaking the Irish language. They were also banned from marrying Irish people. Adopting Irish names, dress, or customs was prohibited. These laws aimed to maintain a distinct English identity and prevent assimilation into Gaelic society. They showed a clear intent to separate the communities. The enforcement of the Statutes of Kilkenny was often difficult. The English Crown's authority did not extend effectively across the whole island. Many English settlers outside the Pale continued to interact with their Irish neighbors. They spoke Irish and adopted local customs despite the laws. However, the statutes were important symbolically. They set a precedent for future policies of linguistic and cultural suppression. They clearly marked the Irish language as undesirable from the perspective of the English rulers. This was an early sign of the struggles to come for the native tongue. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century added another dimension to the language issue. England became a Protestant country under Henry VIII. Ireland, however, remained predominantly Catholic. Religion became intertwined with national identity and loyalty. The English authorities promoted the use of English in religious services. They encouraged translations of the Bible into English. The Irish language became more strongly associated with Catholicism and, by extension, with opposition to English rule. This religious divide further marginalized Irish speakers and their language in the eyes of the state. Formalizing English dominance. Under King Henry VIII, the policy of Anglicizing Ireland intensified considerably. He declared himself King of Ireland in 1541. This move signaled a stronger assertion of English sovereignty. A key piece of legislation was the Act for the English Order, Habit and Language, passed in 1537 by the Irish Parliament. This act explicitly aimed to make the Irish people adopt English customs, dress, and, critically, the English language. It was a direct attempt to transform Irish society from within. The act stated that Irish habits and language kept the king's subjects from obeying the king's laws. The 1537 Act had several practical implications for language use. It required that all office holders under the Crown should speak English. If they did not, they were supposed to learn it or risk losing their positions. The Act also encouraged the establishment of English language schools in every parish. The stated goal was to teach English to the Irish population. This was framed as a way to civilize the Irish people. The underlying assumption was that Irish culture and language were inferior. Promotion of English was seen as a tool for social and political control. During the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, these policies continued and expanded. The Tudor reconquest of Ireland was pursued with vigor. Further plantations took place, displacing more Irish speakers. English settlers brought their language and established it in new areas. English became increasingly entrenched as the language of administration and law. While some English officials recognized the practical need to use Irish for communication, the long-term policy was clear. The aim was the eventual replacement of Irish with English throughout the island. This was seen as essential for security and loyalty. These statutes and decrees were not merely symbolic. They were deliberate instruments of colonial policy. The British Crown understood that language was deeply connected to culture and identity. By suppressing the Irish language, they aimed to weaken Irish cultural resistance. They sought to break the bonds that held Gaelic society together. The goal was to create a more homogeneous, English-speaking population. This population would, in theory, be more loyal and easier to govern. The formalization of language control through law laid the groundwork for centuries of decline for the Irish language. English in governance, law, and commerce. The imposition of English in official spheres drastically altered Irish society. In government, English became the sole language of administration. All official documents, records, and communications were in English. Irish speakers who did not know English were excluded from participating in governance. They could not hold positions of power or influence. Access to the state and its resources increasingly depended on proficiency in English. This created a clear linguistic hierarchy. English was the language of the rulers, while Irish was the language of the ruled. The legal system underwent a profound transformation. The ancient Irish Brehon law system was gradually dismantled. It was replaced by English common law. All court proceedings were conducted in English. Judges, lawyers, and court officials used English. Irish speakers who came before the courts were at a severe disadvantage. They often could not understand the charges against them. They could not follow the legal arguments or present their own cases effectively. Interpreters were not always available or reliable. Justice, for many, became an alien and incomprehensible process. Commerce and trade also saw a significant shift towards English. Major towns and port cities became centers of English linguistic influence. As trade with Britain and the wider English-speaking world grew, English became the language of business. Economic opportunities were increasingly linked to the ability to speak English. Irish speakers found themselves marginalized in the evolving economy. To participate in trade or secure better employment, learning English became a practical necessity for many. This economic pressure further contributed to the decline of Irish in public life. This linguistic transformation was not a natural or accidental development. It was the result of deliberate policies enacted by the British state. The aim was to integrate Ireland more fully into the British political and economic system. Language was recognized as a powerful tool of colonization. By establishing English as the language of power, the authorities sought to erode Irish distinctiveness. They aimed to create a society where English was the norm. This would, in their view, ensure Ireland's loyalty and subservience to the British Crown. The consequences for the Irish language were profound and long-lasting. English-only education. The classroom as a battlefield. English-only education. Education became a primary instrument for the Anglicization of Ireland. From the time of Henry VIII, efforts were made to establish parish schools. A key objective of these schools was to teach the English language. They also aimed to instill loyalty to the English crown. The idea was to mold young Irish minds. Children would grow up speaking English and adhering to English customs. This was seen as a long-term strategy to pacify and assimilate the Irish population. These early schools, however, had limited reach and impact initially. A more systematic approach to Anglicization through education came with the charter schools in the 18th century. These schools were established with the explicit dual purpose of converting Irish Catholic children to Protestantism and eradicating the Irish language. Children were often taken from their families and placed in residential schools. In these institutions, they were forbidden to speak Irish. The use of Irish was frequently met with punishment. The charter schools aimed to break the transmission of Irish language and culture from one generation to the next. They represented a harsh form of cultural engineering. The most widespread and impactful educational initiative was the National School System, established in 1831. This system aimed to provide primary education to the masses. While it brought literacy to many, it did so exclusively through the medium of English. The Irish language had no official place in the national schools for much of the 19th century. In fact, teachers often actively discouraged its use. Children were punished for speaking Irish, even in the playground. A notorious implement called a tally stick was sometimes used. A notch was made on the stick when a child spoke Irish, leading to punishment. The English-only education system had a devastating effect on the Irish language. Generations of Irish children were educated without any formal instruction in their native tongue. They were taught to see English as the language of knowledge, progress, and opportunity. Irish, by contrast, became associated with ignorance and poverty. The vital link between the language of the home and the language of education was severed. This internalization of the idea that English was superior accelerated the shift away from Irish. Impact on Irish speakers. The weight of the penal laws. Impact on Irish speakers. The penal laws were a series of oppressive statutes enacted primarily during the late 17th and early 18th centuries. These laws were mainly targeted at Irish Catholics. At the time, the vast majority of Irish speakers were Catholic. Therefore, although the laws did not explicitly outlaw the Irish language itself, they had a profound and detrimental impact on its speakers. The laws aimed to disempower the Catholic majority. They sought to secure Protestant dominance in Ireland. This had severe social, economic, and cultural consequences for the Irish-speaking population. Under the penal laws, Catholics faced severe restrictions. They were largely barred from owning land. Their rights to inherit or lease land were severely curtailed. Catholics were excluded from holding public office and from voting in parliamentary elections. They were also prevented from entering professions such as law, the military, and higher positions in government. Access to education was also restricted. These measures effectively created a subjugated Catholic underclass. This underclass was overwhelmingly Irish-speaking. The laws systematically impoverished and marginalized them. The social and economic disenfranchisement caused by the penal laws had a direct impact on the status of the Irish language. Irish became increasingly associated with poverty, landlessness, and powerlessness. English, on the other hand, was the language of the Protestant ascendancy. It was the language of landowners, officials, and those with social and economic standing. To escape the crushing weight of the penal laws, some Irish Catholics converted to Protestantism. This often entailed adopting English and abandoning Irish. For many others, English became a prerequisite for any form of advancement or even survival. While the penal laws did not directly prohibit the speaking of Irish, they created an environment where the language was severely disadvantaged. The laws eroded the social and economic foundations that supported the language. The traditional Gaelic learned classes, who had been patrons of Irish literature and culture, were dispossessed and scattered. The language was relegated to the homes and communities of the poor. It lost its prestige and its public functions. The penal laws, therefore, played a crucial role in undermining the Irish language and accelerating its decline by disempowering its speakers. The famine's devastating linguistic blow. The famine struck Ireland with catastrophic force from 1845 to 1849. The failure of the potato crop, the staple food for a large part of the population, led to mass starvation and disease. It was a human tragedy of immense proportions. Over 1 million people died. Another 1 million were forced to emigrate in search of survival. The famine left an indelible scar on Irish society. Its consequences were far-reaching, affecting not only demographics and economics, but also language and culture. The famine disproportionately affected the poorest sections of Irish society. These were often the people living in rural areas, particularly in the west of Ireland. These regions were also the main strongholds of the Irish language. Many of the victims of starvation and disease were monoglot Irish speakers, or bilingual speakers who used Irish as their primary language. Entire communities where Irish was the dominant language were decimated. The famine, therefore, directly caused a massive reduction in the absolute number of Irish speakers. The language lost a significant portion of its demographic base in a very short period. Emigration, both during and after the famine, further accelerated the decline of Irish. Millions fled Ireland, seeking refuge in countries like the United States, Canada, Britain, and Australia. Many of these emigrants came from Irish-speaking areas. Once abroad, they found themselves in predominantly English-speaking environments. To find work and build new lives, they had to learn English. The Irish language was often not passed on to their children. It became a language of the old country, a reminder of poverty and suffering. Thus, the famine led to the loss of Irish speakers, not only through death, but also through displacement. In the aftermath of the famine, attitudes towards the Irish language shifted among some of the remaining population. English was increasingly seen as the language of survival and opportunity. The famine, therefore, acted as an unintentional but powerful catalyst, hastening the decline of Irish and strengthening the dominance of English. The long-term cultural impact echoes through generations. The long-term cultural impact. The decline of the Irish language, driven by centuries of suppression and hardship, had a profound and lasting impact on Irish culture and identity. Language is not merely a tool for communication, it is a vessel that carries a people's history, their traditions, their unique ways of seeing the world, and their collective memory. When the Irish language receded, a significant part of this cultural heritage was eroded. A deep sense of loss permeated Irish society. This loss affected how Irish people viewed themselves and their connection to their past. A damaging consequence of language suppression was the internalization of shame associated with speaking Irish. For generations, Irish was portrayed as the language of poverty, backwardness, and ignorance. English, in contrast, was promoted as the language of modernity, progress, and civilization. Many Irish speakers came to believe this themselves. They felt that their native tongue was an obstacle to advancement. This led to a reluctance to speak Irish, or to pass it on to their children. This internalized oppression was a powerful force in the language shift. It created a psychological barrier to the preservation of Irish. Ireland possessed a rich and ancient literary tradition in the Irish language. This tradition spanned centuries, encompassing epic tales, poetry, historical chronicles, and folklore. As the language declined, this vibrant literary heritage suffered greatly. The patronage system that supported Gaelic scholars and poets collapsed. Many manuscripts were lost or destroyed. The oral tradition of storytelling and song, which had been a cornerstone of Irish culture, also weakened. While some material was collected and preserved by scholars, much was irretrievably lost. The cultural landscape of Ireland was permanently altered. Even today, the legacy of language suppression continues to shape Irish identity. Many Irish people feel a sense of disconnection from their ancestral language. While English is now the first language of the vast majority, there is often a complex and sometimes ambivalent relationship with both Irish and English. There can be a feeling of something missing, a cultural wound that has not fully healed. The efforts to revive and promote Irish are, in part, an attempt to reclaim this lost heritage. They seek to restore a vital part of what it means to be Irish. Revival and resilience. A future for the ancient tongue. Revival and resilience. The late 19th century witnessed the emergence of a concerted effort to revive the Irish language. This movement, known as the Gaelic Revival, was a response to centuries of decline. A key organization in this revival was the Gaelic League, founded in 1893 by figures like Douglas Hyde and Ewan MacNeill. The League's aim was to de-Anglicize Ireland. It promoted the speaking of Irish, the study of Irish literature, and the celebration of Irish music and customs. It played a crucial role in fostering a renewed sense of pride in Irish culture. Following Ireland's independence from Britain in 1922, the new Irish Free State gave official status to the Irish language. It was declared the first official language of the country. Irish was made a compulsory subject in all state-funded schools. Efforts were also made to promote its use in public administration and broadcasting. These state-led initiatives aimed to reverse the language shift and restore Irish as a widely spoken vernacular. However, these policies met with mixed success. The dominance of English in many aspects of life proved difficult to overcome. Today, the Irish language holds a unique position in Ireland. It remains an official language of Ireland and is also recognized as an official language of the European Union. There are designated Irish-speaking regions, primarily located along the western seaboard. In these areas, Irish is still the everyday language of the community. Despite the progress made, challenges to the revitalization of Irish persist. English remains the dominant language in most domains of Irish life, including media, business, and popular culture. Maintaining and expanding the use of Irish requires continuous effort and investment. However, there is also a strong sense of passion and commitment among a growing number of people. Modern technology and social media offer new platforms for learning and using Irish. Community initiatives and cultural events play a vital role. The struggle to save and strengthen the Irish language continues, fueled by a deep love for this ancient tongue and a hope for its vibrant future.